Some of the most dangerous things about the 1970s were the ones nobody worried about. Parents smoked in sealed cars with children in the back seat. Kids played over asphalt, rode without restraints, and reached under sinks full of chemicals with caps that opened easier than a soda bottle. Bedrooms were painted with toxins. Schools were built with fireproof materials that could scar your lungs decades later. And X-ray machines were used in shoe stores to check how shoes fit. That's not the edge of the 1970s. That is the middle of it. That's what ordinary looked like. And that's what makes this decade so hard to explain now. The danger usually wasn't hidden. It was familiar. People remember the objects. What they forget is the world that made those objects make sense. A world where danger could sit right in the middle of everyday life and still look responsible, modern, even safe. And once you see that world clearly, the house, the car, the school, and even the doctor's waiting room start to look very different. But most of it did not begin in some dramatic place. It began where daily life begins. In the house. The 1970s house had a smell. Fresh paint, dust warming on a heater, floor cleaner, something faintly chemical under all of it that nobody noticed because it belonged there. The walls felt solid, the cabinets were full, the place was supposed to protect you. And in a way, that is what makes this part so hard to explain now. The danger was not hiding from the family. The family was living right inside it. Take a child's bedroom in the 1970s. Maybe the walls were redone before school started. Maybe somebody painted the trim on a Saturday and left the windows open to dry it out. It looked clean, new, taken care of. And that mattered. Lead paint had been used for decades because it worked. It covered well, it held color, it lasted, it dried smooth. If you were a parent trying to keep a decent house, this was not some reckless shortcut. This was the standard. Today, the phrase lead paint sounds almost cinematic, like a warning label from a different civilization. But back then, it was just paint. That's the point. Children in those homes were around it constantly, on walls, windowsills, doors, trim. If the paint chipped, if the dust settled, if little hands touched it and then touched a mouth, the exposure was there. And because lead is a neurotoxin, the risk was greatest for the children who were too young to understand any of that. No parent was looking at a freshly painted room and thinking they had introduced poison into the house. They were doing the opposite. They were improving it, making it nice, making it ready for their child. That is what makes so much of the 1970s hard to judge from a distance. People were not usually choosing danger over safety. They were choosing what safety looked like at the time. Residential lead paint would not be banned until 1978, which means families spent most of that decade living in the final years of something that had already become unacceptable. They just didn't know it yet. And lead was not the only thing in the walls. There was something else in there, too. Something put there for a reason that sounded responsible. Something installed specifically to make the house safer. Know what it is? Asbestos. If lead paint sounds reckless to us now, asbestos is even stranger because it wasn't used by accident. It resisted heat. It slowed fire. It was durable. Engineers and builders reached for it because it looked like protection, so it ended up everywhere. In insulation, in old floor tiles, in pipe wrap, in ceiling material, in the hidden parts of the house where the family never looked, and in some cases, in the parts they walked on every day. And that's the deeper point here. The danger was not always the result of neglect. Sometimes it came from a system trying to solve one problem and creating another. A 1970s family could have been living in a house with asbestos and felt grateful for how solid and well-built it was. They might have thought of it as modern, safe, fire-resistant, thoughtful. But when asbestos fibers become airborne and get into the lungs, the damage can take decades to show itself. Mesothelioma, lung disease, cancers that do not arrive until long after the room itself has changed, long after the child in that room has grown up. That long delay matters. It meant the cause and the consequence were separated by so much time that normal people could not see the relationship clearly. Restrictions would begin in the late 1970s and continue in the years after, but the material already built into millions of houses did not simply disappear. In many cases, it stayed where it was, managed, covered, worked around. Personally, I remember having to remove asbestos from pipes in my home in the early 2000s. How about you? So now we have the shape of the house. The walls could be dangerous. The insulation could be dangerous. And then there was the place families reached into every day without a second thought. The cabinet under the sink. Open that cabinet in your mind and you can see it immediately. Spray cleaners, bleach, ammonia, maybe insect killer, maybe furniture polish, a row of bottles with bright colors and strong smells, all tucked underneath the place where the dishes were washed. Then move to the medicine cabinet. Aspirin, ointments, old prescriptions, mouthwash, maybe rubbing alcohol, maybe something with no childproof cap at all. Just twist and open. Today, we take for granted that danger in a home should at least be slowed down. Child-resistant caps, safer packaging, products pulled higher out of reach. We have built friction into the system, but not then, or not fully. In the early 1970s, that shift was just beginning. And in ordinary homes, the older logic still held. Adults used these things. Children were expected to know not to touch them. That was the model. It sounds almost unbelievable now because our modern instinct is to redesign the object. Make it harder to open, harder to spill, harder to misuse. But the older instinct was different. The object stayed convenient. The burden stayed on the person. And that wasn't only true for cleaning products. Household pesticides were part of that same world. Spray the baseboards, spray the corners, solve the problem. The bottle came from the store. The ad looked respectable. The home looked protected. This is the cabinet nobody thought about twice. That's why it matters. The danger wasn't in some forbidden ritual. It was in routine maintenance, cleaning the sink, killing bugs, putting medicine away. The house was doing what houses were supposed to do. And that is exactly why the risk stayed invisible for so long. Everything we've looked at so far was inside the house. The walls, the ceiling, the cabinet under the sink. But the house, at least, stood still. The car was different. The car was moving, and everyone was in it. Think about a summer drive in 1975. Vinyl seats, warm from the sun, the radio low in the front, The smell of gas, hot air, and cigarette smoke mixing together every time the car slowed at a light. A child in the back seat, not strapped in, not especially worried, elbows up near the window, watching the road slide away behind them. And nobody in the car thought this was some bold gamble. This was an afternoon. The strangest part about old car safety is that the physics were not mysterious. A crash at even modest speed turns the inside of a car into a field of momentum. The dashboard does not care how loved the child is. The windshield does not care that the baby was being held carefully. But culture had not yet caught up to that reality. Seatbelts existed, child seats existed, but using them was inconsistent, loose, and often treated as optional. Many families simply did what felt natural. Hold the infant. Let the toddler sit between adults. Let the older kid stretch out in the back seat or stand and watch through the front gap between the seats. And you can understand why it felt safe. A parent's arms feel protective. Keeping a child close feels protective. Telling a kid to sit still feels responsible. But in a collision, affection does not change mass. A lap does not become a restraint system because the parent means well. That gap matters. The gap between emotional logic and physical reality. The engineers knew more than the culture did, or maybe more precisely, they knew it in a way daily life had not yet absorbed. Standards were still evolving, laws were still coming. The behavior that now feels automatic had not yet been converted into habit. So when people look back and say, "How could parents do that?" the answer is usually simple. Because it did not feel like neglect. It felt normal. It felt like every other ride they had ever taken. And before we leave the car, there is one more thing. It sat in the armrest or the ashtray of almost every family vehicle. And it may be the item on this list that has aged the worst. A cigarette in a moving car used to feel nearly invisible. The window cracked slightly. Ash tapped into the tray. Smoke pulled sideways in the draft. Some parents smoked on short errands, some on long trips, some with the windows down, some in the rain with everything shut. And kids were right there, in the back seat, in the front seat, in a sealed metal box, breathing whatever the adults were breathing. Today, that sounds almost surreal. We live in a world where smokers get pushed farther and farther to the edges, outside the building, away from the door, sometimes away from the property entirely. But then, smoking could exist inside the deepest part of family life without causing much social friction at all. And this is important. The parent smoking in that car was often not careless in any general sense. They could be loving, attentive, disciplined, protective in every other way. The cigarette did not signal indifference. It signaled the limits of the era's understanding. Warnings on packs existed, but the public framing was still centered mainly on the smoker. The idea that the child in the back seat was also being medically endangered had not yet settled into everyday culture with anything like its later force. That is why this item feels so revealing now, because the space is so intimate. The child cannot leave, the car is closed, the exposure is concentrated. And still, at the time, most people did not think twice. That phrase matters in a video like this. Most people did not think twice. That is what an era sounds like before the culture turns. The house and the car were private spaces, your family's choices, your family's habits. But what is harder to absorb is what happened in the places families did not directly control. The school, the store, the doctor's office, the places that were supposed to be regulated. Picture a school hallway in 1973. Thick ceiling tiles, glossy floors worn by years of shoes, lockers, bulletin boards, everything heavy, permanent, institutional. It looked built to last because it was built to last. That was the entire point, and the same logic that shaped the house shaped these places too. Use the strongest materials, use the modern methods, make it safe, make it durable. So yes, asbestos was in schools too. This was not some fringe oversight in neglected buildings. It was part of mainstream construction logic across decades. Acoustic tiles, pipe insulation, fireproofing materials. Products chosen because they seemed to reduce risk in spaces full of children. And again, that is the pattern. The danger was often hiding inside the very thing meant to reassure people. A parent sending a child off to school was not worrying about the ceiling. Why would they? The building had passed inspection. It had administrators, maintenance staff, official oversight. It carried the full visual authority of the institution. But aging material in an active school is not a static thing. Doors slam, air systems cycle, repairs get made, surfaces crack, fibers move, and the people underneath it are children who will spend years in that environment before anyone even begins to ask the right questions. There is something chilling about that kind of danger because it is so impersonal. Not one dramatic mistake, not one bad choice, just a building functioning normally while the risk accumulates quietly overhead. Some of the approved things were harder to see coming. Now picture a shoe store, carpet sample underfoot, a salesman kneeling, a child being fitted for school shoes, and over in the corner, a machine that could show you the bones of your feet inside the shoe. That sounds like parody now. It sounds made up. But it was real. The shoe-fitting fluoroscope used X-ray technology to make the process feel scientific, precise, modern, responsible. You were not just buying shoes. You were verifying the fit with the authority of machinery, and that is why it belongs in this story, because it captures one of the strangest patterns of the mid-century world. If something looked more technical, more official, more advanced, people often trusted it more. Children stood in those machines while adults looked at glowing images of foot bones inside leather shoes and felt reassured by what they were seeing. The machine gave the store prestige. It made the service feel elevated. But repeated radiation exposure in a shoe store is one of those facts that seems almost too absurd to absorb, which is exactly why it works here. It resets your understanding of what normal used to include. Not everything dangerous in the old world looked crude. Some of it looked sophisticated. The store sent the children home. The doctor's office is where they went next. And this may be the image that lands hardest in the entire story. A waiting room, magazines on a table, an ashtray beside them, a doctor at a desk with a cigarette burning while patients come and go. Maybe even a hospital floor where smoking was treated as ordinary background behavior. There is almost no stronger symbol of institutional trust than a medical setting. If the doctor smokes in the office, if the hospital allows it, then what is an ordinary person supposed to conclude? Not just about smoking, about the whole system, about what medicine is willing to tolerate in front of the sick, the pregnant, the elderly, the recovering, the children. And that is why this is the payoff to everything we have been circling. Because the doctor's office was not just another room. It was the room people entered when they needed the truth. The room that was supposed to know more than the house, more than the car, more than the store. If smoking could still exist there as normal behavior, then the 1970s was not simply living with private bad habits. It was living inside an institutional lag. The evidence and the culture were not moving at the same speed. The information was ahead. The room was behind. And that gap between what was known and what had actually changed is the real subject of this story. The house, the car, the school, the shoe store, the doctor. What connects all of it is not carelessness. And it is not exactly ignorance either. There is a word for what it was, and it is worth saying carefully. Think about a kitchen in 1973. A parent wiping a counter, putting away a cleaner, lighting a cigarette, painting the trim in a child's room, driving the family somewhere, buying medicine, sending a kid to school. None of this felt like a moral choice. It felt like Tuesday. That, really, is the diagnosis. The 1970s was not a uniquely reckless decade. In many ways, it was a high-trust decade. People trusted the manufacturer, trusted the label, trusted the doctor, trusted the builder, trusted that if something was dangerous at a serious level, somebody above them would have already stepped in. And that trust was not irrational. It was a reasonable response to a world where authority still carried real weight. If a product was sold in a respectable store, if a material was built into a school, if a doctor used it, if a parent had seen it their whole life, then of course it felt acceptable. The problem was not that people refused all evidence. The problem was that the systems for acting on evidence were incomplete, slow, and in some cases, brand new. That is why so many things in this story share the same emotional texture. They were familiar before they were fully questioned, routine before they were fully verified. In case after case, the underlying information existed before the culture changed. The physics of crashes existed before seatbelt habits. The health risks existed before the bans. The toxicology existed before the packaging changed. So the real story is not that the 1970s was full of crazy people doing crazy things. The real story is that millions of ordinary people were living inside a lag between knowledge and behavior, between evidence and institutions, between warning and redesign. And once you see that shape, it becomes harder to laugh at the past too easily, because there is a useless version of this story where we stand above it and say, imagine how foolish they were. But that version lets us off too easily. The more useful version asks a harder question. What do we trust right now because it feels familiar? What are we surrounded by today that has the full force of normal behind it, but not yet the full force of scrutiny? That is the part the 1970s can still give us. Not superiority, perspective. Every era has things that feel safe because they are ordinary. The 1970s just gives us enough distance to see that clearly. If you like this one, there's plenty more of back then left to explore. I'll leave the next one right here. See you soon.